Hey, my name is Ben. Thanks for stopping by. Today we're going to be running a line set to this particular mini split, and we're going to go through all the specific things that you guys need to know in order to have a successful installation of a line set with no leaks. So let's get started installing this line set. This is by far the most important part of your entire installation, is getting these flare connections right. If you have a leak in one of these fittings, you are putting your system's longevity at significant risk, because if you are able to make a totally leak-free installation, you are likely going to have very minimal problems for the life of your mini split. All right, we'll start with the smaller of the two lines that we have to flare. The tools that we'll be needing to make this flare connection are a high quality pipe cutter like the one I'm holding here, a needle nose pliers which we'll be using as a reamer, and finally the flaring tool itself. I'd recommend springing for the yellow jacket over the Chinese copycat versions, and we're just going to start by cutting this past the last imperfection that we can see, which is going to be right about here. The slower you cut it, the less of a burr you're going to create inside of the tubing. So I'm just tightening it a little bit at a time, and we'll slowly work our way through it. If your line set came with factory flares installed on the ends like mine did, you're going to want to go ahead and cut those off and throw them away. There's a few reasons why we have to do this. The first one is that generally speaking, the factory flares are just garbage. 7 out of 10 times you'd probably be fine, but those 3 out of 10 times you're going to end up with a leak. There are so many imperfections that I've seen on the factory flares, scratches and miscellaneous problems. The second reason is that you want to use the flares that are included with your actual equipment. The inside unit and outside unit will have flare nuts attached to where the connections are going to be made, and those are the nuts that you actually want to take off and use on your line set. And the third reason is that you actually are likely going to need to trim your line set to a specific length, so you're going to have to cut the line set anyway, at least on one end. So just start fresh and do new flares on both sides of your line set. When you can feel it starting to get close, instead of cutting through the rest of the way, you can kind of just push it to the side like that. Now we can remove the flare nut that came with this line set, and then we'll get the flare nut that came with the mini split. Now that our flare nut is in place, we are ready to deburr the inside of this pipe. Now you can use a deburring tool, or you can even use a knife to kind of carefully remove that burr on the inside of that pipe and make sure that the burrs don't fall into the pipe. It actually works really well to just use a needle nose pliers as a reamer. That's basically going to push that burr to the outside, and once we use our flaring tool, it will totally push that burr to where it's completely irrelevant. So I'll just gently push in and rotate, and it's gonna spread out the lip of the pipe just a little bit. Now that we got the inside of our copper tube reamed out, we're going to go ahead and clamp the 3/8 size over the end, and we want to let that extend out just a tiny bit. Here's the official recommendation for 3/8. They want it to be anywhere between 1 millimeter and 1.6 millimeters above the face of the tool. So now that we know that, we can look at this, and we want it to be 1.6 millimeters at the most, which comes out to be kind of close to a 1/16. Right about there looks good. Now we're going to slide the rest of our flaring tool over the spot where we want to create our flare, and you can see this little arrow should line up with this line right here on the flaring tool so that it can clamp down properly. So we just tighten it and just make sure that there's no gap right here between the two halves of the tool. Now we're ready to tighten down. See how it kind of rolls around in a circular motion? That is what allows this thing to make a higher quality flare than a standard flaring tool, which would normally just mash that cone right down into the end of the pipe. And that's it right there. We'll back it off, loosen the clamp, slide this back, open up the tool, and there we have our flare. You can see on the very outer edge of the flare, the copper is cracking a tiny bit, and that's not really a concern at all. As long as your flare nut goes over the top and rests properly, it's going to be perfectly fine. So this one's good to go. Let's go ahead and do our second flare fitting. Take our tubing cutter and cut back just far enough that we're past where the previous die had squeezed down onto the copper. We're going to take off our factory flare nut that came on this line set and replace it with the nut that came with the mini split. And take our needle nose and ream out the inside. That's adequate, and I can feel this with my pinky. Make sure that there's no burr left. Now we'll take our flaring tool And according to this chart, they want it to be anywhere between 2 millimeter and 2.2 millimeters. So right at around a 1/16 of an inch. Pretty much just eyeball that height. Let's go ahead and make our flare. Made contact right about there. Now we'll back it off. We can see that the face right inside of this flare is really nice and smooth, and that's the spot that matters. That's where the seal is made between the copper pipe and the brass fitting that it connects to. Here's the difference between the factory flare that I'm holding in my hand here and the flare that we just created. You can see that there are a few more imperfections in the face of the factory flare than we have in the flare that we just created. And you can see what I'm talking about with that burr. By reaming this with the needle nose a little bit, it pushes that burr out enough that when you flare it, that burr stays to the very outer edge and it doesn't get rolled over onto the inside. Here's the comparison of the factory flare on the smaller line versus the flare that we made. That little bit of coating right there on the flare that we made was from the needle nose. There was a little bit of clear coat on there that rubbed onto the copper. Shouldn't really affect the flare whatsoever though. If you don't feel comfortable doing the whole process of flaring your line set and then pulling a vacuum in order to let the refrigerant go, there are products out there that don't require you to make flare connections. So I will link in the description to some systems that have what they call No-Vac line sets or pre-charged line sets that have basically a little bit of refrigerant in them already. And when you make the connection, everything just connects automatically and you don't have to worry about any of the stuff that we're talking about in this video, or most of it anyway. So if you're interested in that, I'll put a link to those systems in the description of this video. Stick around till later in the video where I will show you the use of Nylog and a deburring tool. Stay tuned if you want to see that. So these are the inside connections that we are going to be using with connecting to the indoor unit. So we'll take these plugs and put them back in here. This is just going to keep dirt and stuff out of the line set while we push these through the wall. So let's get these fed through. I went ahead and made a mark on the line set where it's going to be exiting the side of the building, because whenever possible you want to use the natural bend of the line set from when it was rolled up. So we're going to keep this little bit of bend that we have here, and I know that I'll need my line set to be turning right at this point. What I like to do generally is just roll it right on the ground, and that usually does a pretty nice job of rolling it out gently. Right here's our marker. We're going to be going through the wall, and I'm going to go ahead and just do a little bit more bending right now. All right, I'm hoping I can get the extra bit of this roll to sit on top of the mini split, because we're going to be turning and going horizontally. Let's go inside and pull it in the rest of the way. And there they are, poking through. This right here, this is the drain line, and you want to keep the drain line on the bottom of all of our pipes that are going through the wall. This is where it helps to have two people to pull the line set through. But since none of you guys are here right now, I'm going to do it on my own. Maybe I'll go outside and push it through a little bit more. I know that I need to lift it up outside to get these to go down. There it is, all right. Whatever mini split you have should have some kind of a diagram explaining the torque settings for each of the different size fittings that you have to connect. The one other thing you may want to consider is convincing all the crickets to stop making noise. The other optional thing that you could pick up is a little bit of this Nylog blue gasket and thread sealant. A lot of guys swear by it and claim that this makes a huge difference in just making your connections a lot higher quality. For years and years, I've only used standard flare connections with no sealant of any kind, and I very rarely have any sort of leaks. You can probably get by without it, but if you want to just be absolutely sure that you're doing the best that you possibly can, it might be worth picking a bottle up. And since we do have it here today, we will be using a tiny bit of it in our installation process. There should still be pressure inside of these lines. Most manufacturers will pressurize the indoor unit so that you can verify that there are no leaks when you take these caps off. So let's go ahead and do that now. Sometimes I can put upwards of 100 PSI in these things, so once it starts to relieve the pressure, I like to just let it kind of slowly leak out instead of taking it off fully, because it will be sort of a sudden blast of air if you do take it off all at once. Now we'll go ahead and apply some of this Nylog, and it's not going to take very much at all. Just a little dab will do ya. We're going to mainly focus on the mating surface where the inner surface of our flare is going to come in contact with the outside of the fitting. Just get it to where it's starting to drip out of the end of the nozzle. Like that. You can see we have one little drip. Now we're just going to drag that drip around. It's about the consistency of honey, and you only want to use as much as you need. So a bottle like this will last you a very long time. If you want to, you can put a little bit on the back side of the flare. Sometimes when you're tightening your flare nut on here like this, it'll want to grab the copper, and so by putting a tiny dab on there, it's going to just lubricate that spot right there so that it can freely turn. And there's a close-up for you so you can see that we really didn't use that much at all on the ends of these connections. We'll do the large line first. You'll always want to get it hand tightened first, and then the second line. All right, we're ready to torque our connections now, so let's get our torque wrenches ready to go. I want to take just 1 second and say, if you guys aren't subscribed yet, make sure you take a second and do so if you are at all interested in this type of content. I really appreciate your guys' support. In our case, we're going to be connecting this 3/8 size as well as this 5/8 size. So here and here are the torque settings that we're going to be using. 4. And you can see now it's set to 18.4. So now we've got our 2 torque settings programmed into the wrench, and we are ready to go. It's first going to light up the green light and then the red light when we're within 2%, and it'll also change tones. And if we over torque it, it will have a continuous tone when we hit that point. So let's go ahead and just do that. So we'll select our preset number 6, which we programmed to that 18.4 foot-pounds, which is for our smaller of these 2 lines that we're going to be tightening. So we'll first take our standard crescent wrench to hold our fitting in place. And now we can take our second wrench, which is our torque wrench, and place that over the flare nut. I already have my flare nut finger tight, so as we tighten this, the torque wrench will tell us when we have reached the correct torque setting. So here we go. There we go, that's it. So now we've reached the proper torque, but according to the instructions, they want us to actually back it off and then reseat that flare fitting 1 time, which is going to just help that face to for sure seal up properly. So now we'll retorque it again to the proper setting. And that's it. No big deal at all. So now we'll go to our next set point, which is number 7, which we have preset to that 33.2 pound-feet. If you're interested in this particular torque wrench, I'll make sure that I link it in the description under this video, as well as to another video where I go through all the details on how to use this exact wrench. There we go, that's it. Now that method by far is the best in my opinion for torquing your flare connections, but you can also use a crow's foot adapter on a standard torque wrench. This is a click style torque wrench, so as we tighten it more and more, eventually it will click. So if you do want to use this style, all you'll have to do is set the proper torque on the handle of your torque wrench, and then when you attach your crow's foot adapter, make sure that it is set at 90 degrees to the end of the wrench. You do not want to have this in a position where it is straight up like that or straight out, because that's basically going to increase the leverage and you'll end up slightly over torquing your fittings. So even though you can get by with something like this, if you can spring for it and if you're going to be making very many torque sensitive connections, I highly recommend picking one of these digital torque wrenches up. This one's by CPS, and I will link to it in the description right underneath this video. So there you have it. Our flare connections inside here are good to go. Let's go outside and make the connections on the outdoor unit. Now, unless you have a really sharp corner that you need to make, the vast majority of the time you can get by without a tubing bender. In order to not kink these lines, what you have to really just pay close attention to is how you're bending them, making sure that you're just bending them a little bit at a time. I slightly angled this hole in the directions that I wanted it to go, so it's going both down and to the side just a little bit, which gives us a significant advantage for making this corner. And the key is to just bend it a little bit at a time as you round the corner. It's fine if your line set loops out just a tiny bit and then back to the building. It's not going to hurt a single thing, and it's going to prevent you from kinking that line. Our line set is now in place and we are ready to trim our lines to the length that we need. So we got everything in position and made a couple of marks here. And I'm just gonna lightly cut through it because I do not want to actually score the copper. So I'll just partially score through it and then pull it apart like that. Same thing on the small line. There it is. Let the insulation kind of be relaxed so it stays in the same spot as we had it. Now we're gonna mark the actual copper in there. Now we'll be using a zero clearance cutter. The nice thing about these is you can kind of get by with this exclusively as your only pipe cutter. Since it does go all the way, I think, to like 1.1/8 for the largest size that it can cut. It has spring-loaded tension right there that can accumulate. So you could turn it, say 2 times, 2 full rotations down here on the handle, and then just keep spinning it around your pipe, and it will automatically adjust that tension because of that spring there. So I'll link to this in the description if you guys are interested. Not sponsored or anything, just a good product. And obviously, since we're so close to this other pipe, a longer handled pipe cutter wouldn't work nearly as well. This makes it a lot more convenient. All right, we're ready to flare these dudes. Let's do it. Between the no-see-ums and mosquitoes, I'm getting bitten up out here like crazy. No-see-ums everywhere. Do any of you guys have no-see-ums where you live? They're so weird. So before we can make a quality flare, we need to eliminate that burr, and that's what we're gonna use this little deburring tool for. You just hold it straight into the pipe like this while pressing outward and carefully peel that burr off. And oftentimes you have to go around a few times before you get all of the burr removed. That should be about good right there. And you can actually feel with your pinky to feel that that burr has been removed. The one downside to a deburring tool sometimes is it can scratch the inner surface of the pipe a tiny bit. So you have to be really careful to hold your deburring tool such that you're not scarring the material right on this inner edge, because that is the point where the seal of your flare is going to be made. So we're now ready to put our die onto our pipe so that we can complete the flare. Watch how this handle disengages here. So we'll go ahead and keep tightening it until the clutch disengages just like that. And now we know that we have fully seated the flare into the tool. So now we can go ahead and back it off. And there's our flare. Let's get a close look at that. Now I have committed a fatal mistake. Many of you who are probably yelling at your phone or computer as I put that tool on there, you can see that I forgot to put the flare nut on the pipe. There is no way to get this nut onto this pipe without cutting that flare off. And it's very tragic because we did do a very fine job at making that flare. So we're going to go ahead and trim back our copper just past where the die had squeezed the pipe down, because we don't want to make a flare where that die has changed that outer diameter potentially a little bit. So we'll go back about 3/4 of an inch here. We're going to go ahead and take these flare nuts off of this mini split so that we can use them on our lines. To get the insulation out of the way, you can either take and score the insulation here and then just peel it off towards the side, or you can push it back and hold it in place using something like a pipe cutter. In this case, we're just going to take and lightly score our insulation, and then we can always zip tie it back in place. Now we can take and slide our all-important flare nut onto the copper. And obviously you want your pipe facing in a downward direction so that that burr doesn't end up inside of the line, because that can be very detrimental to the system. We're going to just put a tiny drip of this on the end of our cone. So watch as I tighten now. This clutch at the bottom edge will tip so that it actually separates the handle from this threaded portion here. So here we go. There it is. And you can see it rides around and it'll snap back in again. And then it locks in so that we can actually back the handle out now. So we'll back the handle off. And we have a completed flare. So if you extended your copper too far into the tool, what would happen is you would not be able to extend this nut out across the flare. It looks like the Nylog actually did help. There are no imperfections or scratches, and it has just a tiny film of Nylog still on it, so that would help the fitting actually seal a little bit. Here's how it compares to the flare that we made with no Nylog. Both of them look really, really fantastic, but I'd say the one that we just did looks a tiny bit better. So we can slide our flare nut out and across the flare, and you can see that we are going to be good to go for this flare connection. So we have that one little drip of Nylog on there. Now all we're going to do is just drag that around the rest of the face of this flare. What I like to do is visually see that this is lining up properly, like so. It looks really good. And now we'll let the nut slide down. And you always want to hand tighten these as much as possible before you actually get your tools out and your torque wrench. So I'll go ahead and tighten this flare just so you guys can see how that's supposed to go. 33.2 foot-pounds, and we do have our unit set to the correct setting. Now they want us to double wrench this fitting while we tighten it so that we don't tweak the mount basically here. But it's kind of silly because they don't really give you a great way to hold on to this valve. The way they recommend doing it is just by putting your wrench on the valve body like this, and hopefully that will give us a little bit of stability as we tighten this fitting. There we go. And then they recommend backing it off and then retorquing it again. That's it. Now we're going to connect our smaller line here, and we are going to trim back about 1 inch. We're going to match the length by trimming this back just a tiny bit. Make sure to take your flare nut and slide that up onto the pipe before you begin your flare. There it is. Looks absolutely perfect. Take and apply a little bit of Nylog. I'm going to slide this back. Make sure that it lines up like I think it should, which it does. And then we'll spin this down by hand. And we'll be torquing this one down to 18.4 foot-pounds. Reseating it again. There we go. All right, now that we have our line set ran, our flare connections made, and everything is torqued to specification, we are now ready to evacuate the air or pull a vacuum on this line set and then check for leaks before ultimately releasing the refrigerant. Once that video is out, I will put the link right here on the end card of this screen. Otherwise, make sure you're subscribed to get notified when that video comes out. As always, I do my best to put the links in the description to the different tools and accessories that I feature or use in my videos. None of the tools in this video are sponsors. They're just tools that I would recommend and would buy myself personally. I've got several different videos about mini splits and things that are related to this, so I'll put the video that I think that would be most applicable right up here. Otherwise, this one right down here is the one that YouTube thinks that you would like to watch.